A new book by a familiar writer makes a case for America finding itself in a prolonged winter, a place we've been before and a place from which we will again regenerate. Rebecca Ryan is here to talk about her book, Regeneration, a Manifesto for America's Next Leaders, this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. Rebecca Ryan is an entrepreneur, a business owner, a consultant, a public speaker, a futurist, most important, a columnist for Madison Magazine, and an author. Her new book is about nothing less than the state of America and the state of Americans in the context of a historical cycle Ryan likens very successfully, I'll say at the outset, to the seasons. Rebecca Ryan is our guest this morning, and joining me is Madison Magazine editor and the editor of Regeneration, Brennan Nardi. Thanks, Rebecca, for joining us.
What a trip to be here.
Look, the idea of the seasons, I really liked, in part because we all have these emotions that we connect to the seasons, and relating that to the state of our country, I thought was really an interesting approach. Just talk about the seasons first.
You bet.
And how that relates to your feelings about where we are as a country.
You bet. Well, it's important to note that this wasn't an idea original to me. Two authors, Strauss and Howe, wrote a book called The Fourth Turning in the mid-90s, and I read that when I started my business 17 years ago, and it really resonated with me then. They didn't refer to them as seasons. They talked about these turnings. But as I, too, think about seasons, there is something that is very grounding about this idea of seasons. So I simply looked back at America's history and made the argument in the book that America goes through spring, summer, fall, and winter in about 80 to 100 year cycles. And we've been through 3 other winters before this one. And I also sort of, predict that we'll be out of this winter by about 2020.
Now, I also want to make clear that while the seasons is a really nice entry point into this book is an invitation to really think about us as a country and as citizens in this country. And really, I think midway through the book, you ask, who are we not to look deeply at our country? And kind of with the idea that we're waiting for someone else to do it.
Right.
Talk about that invitation which this book offers.
Well, when I was originally concepting this book, in fact, I remember meeting Brennan at the dog park when I knew I was going to ask her to edit this book. And the way that I have been thinking about this since the beginning is as a love letter to my generation and to the next generation. And let me just clarify what I mean by that. So, as many of your viewers know, I've spent most of my life helping the older generation understand the next generation. And it's been amazing. But when the recession happened, what I saw happening was the next generation, my generation, Generation X, and the millennials, were sort of being handed the keys to the car at the very moment that the blizzard started. The recession. Nobody had been through anything like this before. Right. And that's the thing with the seasons. Humans don't live through an entire cycle. So every time we go through a winter, we feel like, oh, have we ever been here before? So I wrote this book as a love letter to the next generation to say, number one, hey, we have been here before. It's going to be okay. But the second thing was to say, if you are breathing oxygen at this moment in time, this is unique. And we can't text it in, we can't tweet it in. We have to do some long-form thinking and analysis of what it's going to take for us to get through winter. And the reason I called the book Regeneration is that I believe that there is a promise through this process of winter turning to spring, where if we do the good thinking, we can be a country that works better for more people.
Were you surprised at the similarities between the going through winter, the generations going through winters past and winters now? In particular, the I generation now really struck me as I was editing your book, how when you talk about how similar they are to the children of the Great Depression. Or not the families of the Depression. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think people are surprised when I talk to them about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning this because I learned a lot writing this book. It took 2 years to do, as you know, and you read every one of the 18 editions of the book. But I used to believe that generations shaped their era. And what I've come to believe is it's very much like the rocking of a boat. You know, the water rocks the boat and the boat creates ripples on the water. And so one of the surprises is that these generations do tend to repeat themselves, because the children who grew up in the Great Depression learned to darn their socks, not waste anything, not take anything for granted. They were do-it-themselvers, right? And that's exactly what the I generation is going to grow up doing. They're going to rely on themselves. They're going to have smaller footprints. They're not going to take things for granted. They're becoming more loyal, more concerned about security. So it was a surprising thing to realize, but then when you put it in these seasonal contexts, it's like, well, of course, kids who grow up when, you know, their parents have lost their jobs and there's not plenty of money to go around, they are going to grow up and act differently.
You spent quite a bit of time describing the 3 previous winters,
Yeah.
and I think that's valuable, but if we can just kind of snapshot what we should look to those 3 previous winters for as we consider the winter that we're in now.
Sure. So the 3 previous winters are the American Revolution, Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Great Depression. And I'll just do one real quick bit. From the American Revolution, I think what we can learn is that there is, during these times of winter, there's always a lot of push and pull between the establishment and the innovators. So during the American Revolution, it literally was the loyalists who were loyal to Britain because they had it pretty good, and the patriots who said, no way, America should be its own idea. It should be its own democracy. So that's one thing that we see now too. We have an establishment that is fearful, maybe, of this new America that's coming on. We're not sure quite how to deal with that. From the Civil War and Reconstruction, the thing that I think we have to learn is that during winters, America usually questions itself. So Civil War and Reconstruction was really America saying, who is America really for? Do African slaves who have come to America get the same rights and freedoms? And we see that now. I mean, just when you think about the Supreme Court and what they've done with DOMA, like who really is protected under our Constitution? Right. And then in the Great Depression, I think that was our first true economic winter. Like this one, our most recent one, has been an economic winter. And I think there again, you know, what FDR did with putting up protections for and new laws for people's money to be secure, for farmers to have crop insurance, for there to be deposit insurance at banks. All of those things were to say that, you know, mainstream Americans shouldn't get so easily swept over when there are decisions that are cataclysmic for the country. So I think that's one of the similarities from this, and I feel like the Affordable Care Act is one of the good examples of how we have a system that wasn't really working for all Americans, and during winter we had this opportunity to say we can do better for more people.
You also make the argument that during each winter there has been an expansion of rights for certain groups, and I want to talk about that when we come back right after this. Madison Magazine editor Brendan Nardi and I are back with Rebecca Ryan, who writes for our magazine, but is also the author of a new book, Regeneration, a manifesto for America's next leaders. And as I said before the break, the idea that in each of the previous winters, there has been a dramatic expansion of recognition of Americans and an expansion of rights for Americans, which lends some hope to this current winter when we think about the way this country is changing and the way that it's going to look. You offer a number of statistics about the way we look and are going to look. But I find it very hopeful, Rebecca.
Yeah, well, the truth, I think the most astounding statistic is to think that 98% of America's growth between 2000 and 2010 was due to Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans. white people, Caucasians, are definitely getting older, but we're also becoming a minority. And that is one of the most, I think, exciting things for the future of our country, because the competitiveness of our country is dependent on us remaining a young country, and it is those populations that are growing that are keeping us young.
I remember when we were editing the book and we talked about how we were sort of going to break it
Right.
to people about this. Like, everyone knows that
Yeah.
demographics are changing and things like that, but it was interesting to go through that process with you and to say, how do we talk about this change without without patronizing anybody, without
Right.
instilling fear in anybody, and having it be a good thing. It was harder than I think we thought to get it right.
So we just relied on statistics. You know, we let the numbers tell the story, because the story is profound. It's really profound, and we see it happening, you know, here in Madison as well.
But that's the idea, that the I generation, this is their world,
Right.
I mean, they get it. This is not a big surprise for them.
So we were sort of, I think, having the conversation with boomers, and there were a couple times during the book, actually, that we had the conversation, and you did some readings
Yes.
as well with boomers about how they were going to react to this book, because it wasn't about, hey, boomers, wake up, because you are very generational. That's the thing that's so interesting now about the book, is that you really can capture each generation and what their role is, what it means, what you're saying to them. But we didn't want to sort of, you know, be disrespectful. We want them to be part of the solution, and that's where you were headed in the book, and I was happy that we did that.
Well, and I mean, we're in a funk, right? I mean, doesn't everybody kind of agree with that? All of the generations would agree that America is in a funk right now.
Well, I mean, I think that most Americans would agree with that, and the numbers would seem to play it out. As an economist, I know that the recession officially ended, you know, a couple of years ago, but people still feel depressed. You know, we're not back to work. We're not necessarily doing better by many metrics that you would measure an advanced country, whether it's educational attainment or so forth. So we do have this moment to really regenerate, you know, to try to snap into gear and do some of the things that need to be done, so that when spring comes again, which I estimate will be about 2020, we are, you know, ready to rock and roll.
And there are roles for all of us.
That's right.
Boomers have a role,
Yes.
Xers have a role, millennials have a role, and then the I generation, which gets it, is going to create the future.
That's right.
And I think that might help with some of the generational friction that we're seeing now, to have someone like you say, hey, this isn't about the changing of the guard always. I mean, those are important,
Right.
but let's all, you know, it's not a kumbaya moment by any stretch, but there are things that each of us can do.
That's right. And just to really summarize quickly, I mean, the way that I see each generation playing a role in the regenerative process of our city and of our state and our country is, you know, boomers, as they head into their elderhood, in traditional societies, elderhood is that cherished place where you go from worker to shaman. And so for those wise elders who can figure out that my job now is to be wise, is to lead, is to, for boomers in the US especially, is to remember those things that they fought and sat in for, and say, how do I put myself on the right side of that?
And do what's required
Do
for
what's
the next
required.
generation, so that the next
Exactly.
generation isn't saddled with the debts, you know.
Right, and all of the debts, right? It's not just financial debts, but we do have social debts as well that have been accumulating. And for the Gen Xers, my generation, my goodness, we have to put down some of our snarky cynicism. You know, we're the first generation of bloggers who are really haters, you know? We have to put down that cynicism and let it transform into pragmatism. I think this is what we see from President Obama. I think he's trying to be a pragmatic leader, but I think he was elected a little too early in the life stage of the country, because we're still in the wintertime place where pragmatism isn't valued. It's still very much like this.
Yeah.
And then for the millennials, you know, the millennials and the I generation, they need to believe that this country's best days are ahead of it. You know, you and I were talking about students, young people in other countries who are very disenfranchised.
Yep.
And we need to make sure that our next generation feels that their best days are ahead of them, but they're not going to have all the answers yet. They're looking to us for what the solutions are.
Yeah. So why does the middle class matter?
It's one of the chapters of the book. So when we were doing the guts of the book, we did every one of the big 6 issues that I wanted to talk about like a question. And that was one of the questions. Why does the middle class matter? And the middle class matters for two reasons. One, it actually ends up creating more wealth for everyone, which is counterintuitive, but any car manufacturer can tell you that if there's no middle class, they have nobody to sell their cars to. And we know what happens when people aren't buying cars. I mean, there's just like a domino effect into our state and into our businesses. So the middle class matters because it creates more wealth for everyone. But as important is when there is a strong middle class, many important societal outcomes are better for all people. There's less crime because there's more trust. There are better health outcomes for more people. Public health nurses will tell you that if they know somebody's income and their zip code, they can tell you about what their health outcomes will be. We know that educational attainment is better when there's a strong middle class. So the middle class matters to America for the reason of prosperity and for the reason of us being a truly civilized society in the capital C meaning of the word.
That's heady stuff when you think of the 1% and the fact that we are moving away from that right now.
And I think what people aren't realizing is that this has been like a drip, drip, drip leak in the roof of our house of America for a long time. Since the 70s, the middle class has been shrinking. But now that it's gotten to the place where it's so exaggerated, and the recession helped in a lot of ways, now people are really, waking up and paying attention.
We'll take a peek at spring when we come back right after this. Rebecca Ryan will be talking about her new book, Regeneration, a manifesto for America's next leaders, October 19th at the Wisconsin Book Festival at 12 noon. It's at the library, the new public library, correct? So you're going to read a little, answer questions, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so this will actually be my second book festival appearance because I got accepted to the Decatur Book Festival, and that was my training wheels. And I said, what do book festival audiences want? They were so gracious. They say, they want you to do a little reading, they want to know why you wrote the book, and they want you to take some questions. So that's what I'll be doing.
Excellent.
Perfect.
And joining us is Brendan Nardi, the editor of Madison Magazine.
And I have a question. So we're in 2013 right now.
Right.
We're going through these seasons, America. We're in winter. You say that winter started around the time that planes crashed into the World Trade Center.
Yep.
We have like 7 or 8 more years minimum to go, and
Right.
and I just have to quote you because it was startling when I read it. Sometimes it takes a good old-fashioned national crisis to jolt our country out of its funk and focus on a larger unifying issue. I mean, wasn't that 9/11? Wasn't that the recession? I mean, are we still headed toward? I mean, are we looking at debt ceilings and government shutdowns now? How do you characterize? What do you think is next?
Right. Well, as a futurist, one of the things I always tell people is that the future isn't singular. There are many possible futures. And some of my guesses about how America is going to come out of our current winter, it could look like what happened after the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was actually just an economic climb that kind of brought us out of this funk. It wasn't a single event. It was just very much an economic climb. We surpassed the United Kingdom in having the largest gross domestic product. Our economy is just going gangbusters. But then if you want to be a fatalist, you could say, is it going to be a war? Are we going to be going to war with a country over oil? And then people who are more pragmatic would say, well, maybe it's going to be climate crisis. Maybe that's going to be the thing that's really going to snap Americans into realizing we do need to create green jobs. We do need different sources of energy than just the kinds that we can pull out of the earth and that are finite. So it could be any of those things.
Or a little of each.
Well, you quote a source that says we don't need one solution, we need a million solutions, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so after we all have a car and an iPhone and all the red meat we can eat, what's being an American?
Yeah, it was.
Right? I mean, we have to rethink that, right?
I believe that we do. One of the questions I ask in the book is, what is the point of America? Yeah. And I think that for a long time, the point has been economic prosperity. But no less than Ben Bernanke, last August, he questioned this, and he said, for a long time, we as economists have measured progress based strictly on economic scorecards. But he said, truly, it is people's well-being. So by that measure, I think we need to rethink our scorecard. What does it mean to be an American? It isn't just endless economic prosperity. That is, from a scientific perspective, that isn't even desirable, because when things are just on runaway, that's like cancer. You know, cancer is a bad cell that's on runaway. Just endless, you know, economic prosperity is not the answer. If we readjust and think, well, what does well-being mean? You know, well-being probably means that we have better educational outcomes for all kids. We have a more informed citizenry. It means that our levels of cancer and diabetes and chronic illnesses that are preventable are prevented. So
We have 2 minutes left, and I know you two must have had interesting conversations about the end of this book. But what do we need to know about emergent properties, balance, and adaptation?
Well,
I mean, that's spring, right?
That is spring. People always say, like, well, Rebecca, if it's going to go through 2020, how will we know when we've come through spring? And I always say that some regions are going to be coming into spring earlier than others. And spring doesn't just happen like you turn the page. There's a thawing that happens when we go from winter to spring. So what we can look for in our communities to know that we're coming out of it are different alliances. So when you start seeing former competitors working together to solve issues, that's one of the signs that spring is coming. Another thing that often happens is spring comes when the grassroots start changing. So the Occupy movement was actually, well, and frankly, the Tea Party movement are both very interesting signs of change that's happening very much at a grassroots, not an institutional level. In fact, the institutions hate these movements. But these are very important signs of spring and rebalancing.
Congratulations to you both. It's a really it's a really good book. And what I'd like to do is maybe come back in 6 months and talk about the response to this book and the conversation that this book has generated. Because I think it will, and I think the generations that we're talking about are going to use social media, and I hope look at the ideas in this book and put them into action. So we'll do that.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
It's a deal.
Thanks,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Rebecca Ryan for being here today, and for Brennan for joining me. Rebecca's book, Regeneration, is available at nextgenerationconsulting.com. Next week, we'll talk about the lasting effects of childhood poverty with Professor of Pediatrics at New York University, Dr. Bernard Dreyer. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.